Now, Lunar Sabbath, you wanted to talk about that. So, man, the Lunar Sabbath is...
Yeah, if you don't follow us, you're going to hell. Going to hell, Nehemia.
Well, so it's interesting. This Lunar Sabbath starts to show up in the 1990s. And I think one of the factors that brought it about, I think, was there's a Jewish encyclopedia that was out of copyright. And so someone had digitized it and put it on the internet. And so these people got a hold of this encyclopedia, Jewish encyclopedia from like 1901 or so, and they start to look at it. And here's what it says. Let me read you what it says. I have it up here on the computer. It's JewishEncyclopedia.com. Now, what they didn't do is they didn't put the more updated Encyclopedia Judaica on the internet, because that came out in 1971, and it even now is still under copyright. So they put the outdated one. And the outdated one says about the Sabbath, it says it was probably originally connected in some manner with the cult of the moon, as indeed is suggested by the frequent mention of Sabbath and new moon festivals in the same sentence. They took that to mean that in the original Jewish calendar, the Sabbath was based on the moon. But if you look there, it says probably. Probably, okay, you tell me something's probable. What's that probability based on? Well, they explain this is a, quote, critical view. Now, in everyday daily speech, if I say critical, I mean something's really important. It's really vital. It's critical. My life depends on it. Yeah. But in scholarship, critical view means we're being critical of biblical tradition. Now, earlier in the same encyclopedia, they explain that according to the Bible, the new moon and the Sabbath go back to creation. And the Sabbath is actually this perpetual 7-day cycle all the way back to creation. With an unbroken, this is Shabbat Night Live. Friday night, Shabbat, that is, if you go back in time 7 days in increments of 7 days, you will reach the day that God rested after 6 days of creation. That is the biblical view.
And that is what the encyclopedia says, this very one, earlier
as
on.
The biblical view. Now, the critical view is, well, we don't believe the Bible.
That's
and what
right.
it's really, and it says this, you guys can read it for yourself. What that means, and what it even explains it means, is, well, if we don't believe it goes back to creation, if we don't believe it goes back to God resting on the seventh day after 6 days of making the world, then it must have some other origin. And what would be that origin?
Yeah, makes
the origin
sense.
is in nature. And what's in nature? If you divide a lunar month by 4, you get increments of 7, not exactly, but close enough. And they said it must go back into some prehistory period, which isn't recorded in ancient Israelite sources because it's prehistory.
Right, there's no evidence of it ever being
there's no evidence
Earth
whatsoever, and it's a great contrast to the new moon. So the new moon today is based on a calculation of Hill II from 359 AD, and it's a very fair question to say, how do you know that? Well, I can show you the Jewish sources that predate 359 AD. If I open up to you the Mishnah, which was written down in the year 210, and I show you how they're still interrogating new moon witnesses, and they tell us in the time of the temple that the priests and the Pharisees had 2 rival courts, and there were witnesses that would go and testify in both courts. And it was a question of authority, but the 2 courts disagreeing on each other's authority didn't disagree that it was cited based on the sighting of the new moon. Now that tells you that in the 1st century, this is what the Jews were doing. Now show me the sources that date to the 1st century for the lunar Sabbath. They don't exist. They don't exist. All you can show me is an encyclopedia from 1901 that says probably and presents it as a critical view. And really, the question I ask is, why is this so popular in the Hebrew Roots movement? What do you think of it, Michael? Why is it so popular? Give it to me straight.
I think people are trying to divide up into little subcults to where their head rabbi, which Yeshua says, call no man, can fleece the flock and milk them.
I don't know. I want to give people the benefit of the doubt, but I hate to say it. With many of the people I've spoken to, and not all of them.
The Jews say it, it's got to be wrong.
There it is. That's what I've heard. Here's the way I've heard it presented.
And I have
by
heard
some
that
of those
many
people.
times,
Here's
too.
how I've heard it presented. These are people who come out of the church, and they say, we were deceived about Sunday. Sunday is the day of worshiping the sun. And then we went to Saturday and found out Saturday was the day of worshiping Saturn. And I'm like...
Yeah, in English.
In English. Not in Hebrew.
Not in Spanish, not in most languages.
That's a good,
it's Sabbato. It's a Sabbath point. In just about every language on the planet except English.
So in Hebrew, Sunday has nothing to do with the sun. It's called Yom Rishon. Then we have Yom Sheni, Yom Shlishi, we have first day, second day, third day, fourth day, fifth day, sixth day, and the seventh day is called Yom Shabbat. The amazing thing about this is if you go to every Jewish community in the world, there was a ancient Jewish community in Kaifeng, China, which was cut off from the rest of the Jewish world for hundreds of years. They've got the same day of the week. They have the same 7-day cycle.
Right.
Go to the Jews of Ethiopia.
No communication around the world.
The Jews of the Ethiopia never had the Talmud, never had an oral law, and they have the same 7-day cycle. And the crazy thing is, not crazy, the beautiful thing is go outside of Judaism and you have the same 7-day cycle. Now, the Christians don't rest on Sunday, they don't rest on Saturday, they don't rest on Shabbat, but they will tell you Sunday is the first day of the week. And the 7th day of the week is Saturday, or in Spanish, Sabado. Go even to the Muslims, who their holy day is Friday. They call it Yom el-Jum'ah, the 7th day of the week. Sorry, the 6th day of the week. They'll tell you, yeah, the 7th day of the week is Yom el-Sabt. That was when the Jews rest, but we don't rest on that day. That was changed by their thing. So they all recognize when the 7th day of the week is, they just don't rest on it. But so the point is, this isn't just a Jewish tradition of one particular group. Every Jewish community in the world and every non-Jewish community in the world has the same 7-day cycle. Now here's what's important. Is it possible that instead of this being Shabbat, this is really the 3rd day of the week, that's really Tuesday? And I say anything's possible. It's possible that aliens came down to Earth and put all of mankind into a deep sleep for 3 days, and when we woke up, we didn't realize that it was Tuesday. It's possible. My question is, where's the evidence for that? And there is no evidence for that. And more importantly, because, it's silly, give me something more realistic. Is there evidence for anyone in Jewish history who said today isn't Shabbat, today is really Tuesday? And there is no evidence for that either. Now, when we come to the yearly Sabbath, we get a completely different story.
Okay, well, before you go to the yearly Sabbath, let me say this. Yeshua kept the Sabbath. Mm-hmm. He did exactly what Moses said to do. He said to do what Moses says to do. Yeah. And he kept the Sabbath with absolute inviolability. Nobody touched it. Yeah. He did break the rules and regulations the Pharisees invented on that day, but he healed on the Sabbath. And there's only one place that I can show you he healed on a day that wasn't the Sabbath. Only one place I can prove that it wasn't on the Sabbath. And so Yeshua kept the Sabbath, the same Sabbath as it is today. Yeah. There's been no change from the first century, absolutely. Yeah. So if he's any authority to the Christian world, then, okay, we got that nailed.
Well, here's an interesting thing, which is a little it's kind of the same topic. So, and I'll try to do this real quick. So you have the Mishnah talking about how witnesses would come to testify that they had sighted the new moon. And it says originally they would accept all witnesses, but then they would require a character witness to come with the witness, a second witness to testify that the first witness sighted the new moon. And what was he testifying? It says this is because of the minim. The minim is the word in ancient Hebrew that means heretics, but it refers specifically to the Jewish followers of Yeshua. And what this tells you is the Jewish followers of Yeshua were showing up at the new moon court to testify they had sighted the new moon. And the rabbis were like, look, we can accept testimony, but not from you guys, which is very interesting.
Anyone except for you.
Well, and so you had to have a character witness show up with you if they didn't know you to say, well, this guy doesn't believe in Yeshua. You can trust him to testify about the new moon. But it shows you the Jewish followers of Yeshua did continue to cite the new moon and even wanted to show up to the court and have their testimony accepted, which it wasn't. But go now to the Lunar Sabbath, and there's no ancient sources that testify to this. It doesn't exist before these critical view people show up in the late early 1900s. And bear in mind, these are the same Jews who eat pork. These are the same, you go to a Jewish rabbi who is of certain denominations and they may, eat shellfish, in their synagogues. So these are the guys who are talking about the critical view. Well, so compare this to the annual Sabbath. That is, every 7 years you have a Shemitah, sabbatical year. And if you look for the ancient sources to see, because there is a tradition of when that takes place, ask a rabbi and they'll tell you we know exactly when that is. But you look at that and you do find as many years as there are traditions for each of those years. In fact, we have ancient tombstones which tell us from the 500s and even the 300s AD, written in the land of Israel and the southern shore of the Dead Sea, and they state what the year is, and they correlate that to the Shemitah cycle, the sabbatical cycle, and they don't line up with a single year. They give you at least 3 different possibilities of when the Shemitah is, and then you go to other rabbinical sources and you find other years could be the Shemitah year. And my point is that if you look at all of Jewish literature that survived tens of thousands of pages, there's no other possibility of when the weekly Shabbat is. On the contrast with the annual Sabbath, it could be just about any year you choose.